So welcome everyone to our Flavors of Fast presentation. I hope you've had a great week in the Payments Canada sessions and have had the opportunity to enjoy a lot of them. I know we've got the last slot here before the wrap up, so we hope to make it engaging and entertaining and talk about the flavors of fast. So we'll start with some intros of our panel. Sorry.
Sure. My name is Michele Poole. I've been working in the payments, fintech, and financial services space for maybe like 20 years as either a bank executive or a management consultant. My client roster has included both domestic and global firms in the B2B and B2C space. For the most recent fintech that I worked with, I helped to launch and onboard global clients to a real-time international payments ecosystem that had funds movement to and from bank accounts and global digital wallets. Right now, I'm working with Interact Corp as the business lead to help build and operate Canada's RTR exchange for Payments Canada.
Okay, if we're going to move to Elena.
Great, thank you. My name is Elena Whisler. I am Senior Vice President of Sales and Relationship Management as well as Marketing at the Clearinghouse. At the Clearinghouse, we run multiple payment networks, ACH, high-value wires, check image, as well as our newest network, RTP, which I'm excited to talk about today, as well as other initiatives and advocacy for the payment system in the United States. So my role is very much to liaison between the industry, the community at large, our clients and prospects with the Clearinghouse. So excited to be here today.
Hi everyone, I'm Vipul Lalka. I head up enterprise payments platform and capabilities for TD, and basically my role involves ensuring that a lot of the payments initiatives within the bank, retail, commercial, wholesale that need to go through, such as e-transfers, RTR, the payments modernization, etc., they are executed by my team. And my background has been in the digital and payment space primarily, starting from a technical field to more management consulting, strategy, and operations. Pleasure to be here and look forward to a great session with the panel here.
Okay, and then as the moderator, my name is Laura Sullivan and I work for FIS. I am responsible in product management for all of the payment schemes we have in the Americas, which in Canada includes e-transfer, links, LVTS, AFT, and then various other schemes in the US and in Latin America. So I'm going to start with just a quick introduction here of our topic. So sorry if I can get the deck. There we go. So the genesis of the name for this conference is this session is a report that FIS publishes annually. We've been publishing it for about 7 years now, called The Flavors of Fast. And in this report, and I don't expect that you can read this eye chart, but just wanted to give you a flavor of what it is, no pun intended. In this report, we are tracking the implementation of what we call faster payment schemes around the world. We've been publishing this about 7 years, started in 2014. The interesting stat for the growth is in 2014, there were 14 schemes live in the world. As you can see, there are many more in this day and age. And now we have 56 countries live on what we call faster payment schemes. And that's been a topic of discussion even as we were preparing for the panel. You know, what is a faster payment or what is a real-time payment? And typically, faster payments, the most consistent definition I've seen is that a faster real-time payment is final, that you can't stop it or cancel it. Obviously, you can politely request for a return, but it is final once it's initiated. And typically it's 24/7 by 365. So, you know, the e-transfer system that's in use in Canada now would really fall under the definition of a real-time payment scheme, but the real-time rail and some of the other ones that we're going to talk about more typically are referred to as instant or immediate payments because the settlement also occurs immediately and the user is aware of what's happening with that payment instantly. So we're really focusing more on instant or immediate payments going forward than a broader umbrella of real-time payments. So with that, I'm going to launch into our first question, which we're going to ask each of the panelists to address, which is, which instant payment schemes do you feel have been successful around the world? And what lessons do they offer us here in Canada as Canada moves to an instant payment scheme? And I'll start with you, Vipul.
Thank you, Laura. So I think I'll pick on one of them, which has been successful in my mind, Australia. And the reason I picked that is not only is it similar to the banking system in Canada, the population size, etc., but also I feel that they have approached it in a very methodical way, similar to how Canada is doing. There was a lot of period in the beginning where they went through discussions and iterations, but since going live in about 2018, first, I think they focused on what I believe is really the crux of a real-time payment system. It's not the real-time nature of the payments, it's actually the data that actually goes through it, how the data is being used. So there's a lot of focus in Australia around the ISO 20022 data format. They specifically looked at use cases around businesses, around consumers, and there are more than 1,400 fields in that ISO 20022 data that they are making available for solving specific use cases around the timeliness and the integration of payments. So that's the first part. The second part is the way it has been organized. So I'll give a couple of examples, one of them being the aliasing nature. So PayID, which is the alias, applies to retail as well as commercial payments. So there is this, in I think the first couple of years, there were 3.5 million users who are registered users of the PayID system. That allows for simplicity of how payments are sent and then gets used across the multiple types of payments on the particular rail. So that was a big success in my mind and getting better as we speak. There's double-digit growth that we are seeing in Australia on the real-time payments part. The second part, which I believe is consistent across all the payment systems, has been the focus on fraud. So in Australia, again, this was initiated by the banks, the institutions, kind of a cooperation model with governance from the top. But there was specific areas like fraud, which are very cooperative, which is how do you deal with fraud, working together with the institutions and then using that data to combat fraud. Because as you know, as the limits increase, and in fact, there is no official limit over here, there could be one or two transactions that cause a huge breakdown in the system. So I think fraud was a big area of focus that Australia did that I really like. And the last part that I'll quickly highlight, and we can talk about it later, is around the innovation, the ability to provide more innovation capabilities, laying this foundation around data, PayID, etc., where we are seeing a lot of use cases, such as, for example, EarnD. So using payroll services on demand, how they are integrating with payroll providers and getting this usage of the real-time system going high. So a lot of learnings like this that we can bring back, not only in the Canadian ecosystem, but as you know, TD Bank is on the US side as well, learnings on the US side as well. I'll pause there and we can get into more topics later.
Thanks, Vipul. Michele?
So I think that the two countries that I would look at would be India and China. And I think that if we look at the kind of common theme and really what was successful and the opportunity for us to learn some lessons, I think the two common themes around mobile payments. And so the fact that mobile payments have become very cheap and easy to use. And then I think also around innovation. So if we first look at India, so I think, in terms of volume, it's pretty significant. India processes roughly, I think it's around 41 million real-time transactions each day. And so if we look at their IMPS and their UPI, I think it would be fair to say that it's really revolutionized real-time and instant payments in India. And India's really become a mobile powerhouse. But if we kind of dig down into some of the reasons around that, the same with both India and China, there's been some of that leapfrogging of the card-based system. But if we look now that as those real-time rails are in place, how is it that they're getting so much use and adoption? And I think really innovation has been really key to growing that usage and adoption. And so in India in particular, we're seeing a lot of things around bill payments, even the ability to pay bills with your fingerprint. We're seeing invoice in a box. We're seeing cross-border cross-border payments. We're seeing some IPO subscription. And so I think the learning for us in Canada to learn is really around, from India in particular, is really around that innovation. And if we look at China for a second, China, they're also processing a significant number of transactions, around 38 million real-time transactions each day. And their system, they really built on a lot of, QR codes and smartphones. And so they eliminated a lot of the bank's role in the payments transactions. And they've really created that alternative payments ecosystem that's dominated by Alipay running through Alibaba, China's version of Amazon, and WeChat Pay running through Tencent, China's version of Facebook. And so faster payments on this new payments ecosystem has really exploded. And it's replaced cards and cash in stores, in gift giving, even, if you wanted to help out a homeless person on the street, a QR code works to make a donation in that regard. So that shift around, banking to technology and social networking, and these faster payments that are embedded inside of these global lifestyle apps, and these super apps, really, I think the lessons for us, and for us to be able to look at that, is some lessons around loyalty and payments. And I think that's an area where we can really look to explore and continue in that theme of innovation once we have the real-time rail in place. Because I think that we'll need to continue to expand and offer additional capabilities and innovation once, the real-time rails are in play.
Thanks, Michele. Very insightful. Elena?
Yeah, well, I'll bring the U.S. perspective, mainly because that's what I'm representing and what I've experienced since being at the clearinghouse. And I think there's a lot of similarities. Particularly, there's a lot of the same players, a lot of the same companies, financial institutions, and I do think there's a lot of good lessons learned. Some things maybe Canada can do differently as they launch the different as they launch RTR. So I think, to remind everyone, in the U.S. we started as market driven, right? It's not mandated by any particular government entity. Very much the needs of the financial system determine that we as a country should move towards real-time payments. And so the Faster Payments Task Force was launched in 2015, and that was a group of over 200 individuals and organizations working together to figure out what does faster payments mean. So Laura, to your point earlier, like, what does that mean for our country? What problems are we solving? What are the criteria it needs? It laid that out. And then over the course of years, 3-4 years, the task force drilled into it, defined it, determined what market players would qualify to run a scheme or network. And there was different, pieces of the ecosystem that were solved. The clearinghouse decided to go ahead during that task force and launch the RTP network, and that went live at the end of November. So we've been live now for 3.5 years or so. And what I can tell you is what you think it's going to solve, or what use cases are going to be the most popular, high priority, weren't. And they might not be for Canada. So the lessons learned, Vipul, your examples, and Michele, your examples might resonate really well for a certain segment or population within Canada, or it might not. And so you have to pivot, and you have to really work towards, what people are interested in doing. And I say that because in order for something to succeed, whether or not you are government mandate or market driven, you need that market collaboration among a very diverse set of constituents and stakeholders in your group. I can tell you, even before we went live, there's a lot of work revolved around specific committees focused on different groups. So corporate committees, government committees, financial institutions, large and small, community banks to large institutions. Those all have different problems they're solving, different niches they're working on, different customers that they service. And that's more eye-opening than anything. So the education involved in that, what it really means. And then I think one of the biggest lessons learned where I think we're accelerating adoption is when you start to see things live, you can do something with that. It's not a theoretical conversation anymore in your backyard, right? So it's one thing to take the examples from lessons learned and you have that trust that it can work. But it's another to actually see it in your backyard, in your front yard, within your house, right? Working towards. So taking advantage of the leaders that are trying it out. They're seeing what works. They're seeing, does QR codes work or not? Some of them fall and you try something else. So there's a lot of that iterative process that's really important to include in any launch of a network or a product. I think that's one of the biggest lessons learned as you go through it.
Thanks, Elena. One of the things that I didn't note at the beginning is we have allowed time for questions, so please use your chat feature in the video call to funnel questions to us, and we'll address those at the end. Meanwhile, we'll move on to a second question that we had, which is what use cases or business value have you seen implemented globally to the extent you haven't covered it, and how do you think those are going to work in the Canadian real-time rail function? So if we could start with Michele on that.
Sure. I think that in terms of business value, at its core, any real-time rail exchange, has three key features in terms of that business value prop. And I think that applies independently of whatever country it's launched in. I think the first one is around speed. And I think the second one is around immediate availability of funds. And then I think the third one is around the ability to confirm receipt of the payment, which is really all about both the end-to-end communication and what Vipul talked about, which is the connecting of the payment and the payment data together in a single transaction. Because that data is where there's a real value proposition and an opportunity for those use cases. And so, some of the use cases that I mentioned that we've seen globally and that I think will be of particular interest to Canada will be around bill payments and around cross-border payments in particular. And I think that that's where there'll be an opportunity to really further leverage the overall value prop of the RTR rail.
Okay. Elena, go to you next.
Yeah, maybe I can spend some time on use cases that we've seen, and that might spark also some additional questions from the chat or whatnot. And that the use cases might bring to light business drivers, but also I think the changing nature of the payments landscape. We've been talking about digitalization for such a long time, and it is here. It's now, it's what we experience day to day. So maybe I'll start with that and then we can feed off of each other. I generally, when we look at use cases, we think about them in three tranches. So we think of bank or financial institution driven use cases. We think of wholesale use cases and then retail use cases. And I think a lot of times people forget about the use cases driven by their own financial institution. So for all of you out there that are representing financial institutions, think about yourselves as a corporate, think of yourselves as an organization that can, that has payments to manage and to deal with. Some of them are honest activity that you can't do in real time, but you really need to, or you need that confirmation that Michele talked about in order to execute something else within your own organization, right? It's really intriguing once you drill into the intricacies of each institution of what you can and can't do. And so the financial driven use cases are just as important to start out and really a great pilot, right? Because you're yourself. So you have, financial institution as a payor, right? So as a disperser, you're distributing payroll, for example, you're distributing other types of payments. Bank or financial institution as a biller. So you are a biller and you are distributing invoices. And then you have card network settlement. So how does that settlement function within your organization on card activity? And how can you make that faster so that you don't need to manage, liquidity related to that card settlement for next day settlement? So those are three that we have started to see really branch out. The second set is around wholesale use cases. So these are wholesale, meaning corporates originating the transaction. It could be B2B or B2C in this case. The main ones that we see, the volume that we see, a lot of it is payroll. So when people look at payroll, you have your standard payroll, and there may be scenarios related to moving that faster over the faster payment schemes, not needing to fund it earlier. You can do it and trigger it that day. So more the precision of the payment of the activity. Then also within payroll, you have the gig economy. So that is a big aspect of what we see here in the United States, the gig economy workers. So companies like Grubhub is very popular in promoting the RTP network, and they basically tell the drivers, if you want to get paid for today, make sure you bank at a bank that offers RTP services. So you have, the car sharing or delivery apps. That gig economy worker is definitely high volume, and not one that we, I think, foresaw, 4 or 5 years ago. It wasn't as popular. Definitely in the last year and a half, that's boosted a lot, and there's more ride-sharing companies that are using the RTP networks to pay their drivers. So that's another one. Emergency payroll is also another one. And then a growing set of use cases around wallets, so e-wallets. And really, there's a lot of fintechs out there that offer services, either budgeting or, emergency funds or rainy day funds. You balance that with a fintech. And then if someone needs those funds, they usually need them immediately. And they don't want to wait 2 days, or they don't, want to manage that. And so being able to withdraw those funds from the wallet to your financial institution account that moment is really important. That could be for any wallet. So that also includes, P2P apps that we see with Venmo, for example, and as well as, Zelle is starting to settle over the RTP network today. So wide range of those fintech use cases that help facilitate the payment into a financial institution account. And then on the retail side, P2P is generally with those fintechs, right? So generally through Venmo or other closed loop networks, and it's really the settlement underneath that is managed through the RTP network. You are starting to see a little bit of account-to-account payments from bank account to bank account, but that is pretty basic because you need routing and account number information, and typically we wouldn't do that. Now you have aliases, you have those directories that are really what today's age needs. So those are the, maybe too much detail, but a lot of the use cases that we're starting to see. Michele, you talked about confirmation of receipt. I think even if what we're starting to see is that feature of just confirming it's done, allows businesses to close an invoice faster. So they have their own SLAs related to how, once you get a payment in, how long do you have to close that invoice? So things can start to happen faster behind the scenes that companies can then, work their time and their employees work on other issues that might have. So those are some to get started. Hopefully some chat comes from that. But I know, Vipul, you have some ideas too.
Absolutely. Thanks. And I think Michele and Elena, you covered a lot of space at that. I'll try to not repeat them, but give some examples. So if I look at business value, how do you actually get the business value? You look at it from two perspectives. One is, how do you take cost out of the system? Or two, how do you actually have value and add value to generate new value and create business value? So the first part, taking cost out of the system, has been the most difficult ones. And especially banks are notorious for that, not because banks want to do it, but we introduce a new payment system and then it stays. We never take out a payment system. So you have checks, you have cash, you have God knows how many payment vehicles that we continue to maintain. So I think that part is going to be a little bit difficult, where how fast can cost be taken out of the system so you move to real time. My view on that is that real time, with the wide gamut it covers, from the timeliness, from the status, availability of status, the data that it contains, it may actually end up, if not replacing everything, replacing a lot of the existing vehicles that we have. So that is going to be a slow one. So that's some business value that I see over there. But then moving to the business value part, how do you add new value? I think that's where I can give a few more examples, complementing hopefully what Michele and Elena were talking about. So take the case of just business-to-business payments. So just the fact that you can now, in a current transaction, not having real-time payments between two businesses, you have the supplier, the invoicer, there's lots of messages going back and forth. There is the email that you're using or telephone calls. Hey, I sent you this payment. Here's your invoice or email, etc. You have a website that you have to download the invoice from. Then it's a complete separate way that you make the payment. I think that is one of the first things that you could start attacking with real-time enabled through ISO 20022, where a supplier can actually send the invoice to a particular entity, and the receiver can actually make the payment through that same transaction, and the entire contract, the entire information is maintained in that whole transaction. So payment is now linked to the invoice. You get into things like, how do you do installment payments? How do you actually have multiple invoices being paid with the same payment? And you don't need an army of back-end folks trying to reconcile everything. You can then integrate with your technology providers to make this all reconciliation process automated. So that's one example of, from a business perspective, how things could actually get simplified quite a bit. The second example I would say is from the data. Now, this is one of those things that's going to be a bit of a stretch. We've heard of data lakes and the value of data for 20 years now. But imagine the similar use case where you now have the invoice with hopefully SKU level data or more data than we normally had as part of the real-time system. You could now look at that data, and banks are in a great position. Others could be potentially as well, fintechs. But you could now look at that data, and an example that comes to mind is, let's say you have someone who manufactures a car, but they have windshield suppliers, and then multiple windshield suppliers are sending you invoices. Now we can actually start looking at that transaction information and getting the average price of what a windshield is. We can provide that information, of course, with anonymity and all the averaging and all that good stuff, to tell or advise our customers, the corporate customers, to say, hey, did you know that average price of windshields is, I don't know, $1,000? And let them infer that with some of them, they're getting a worse deal, and some of them, they're getting very good deals. The last part, I would say, is around like the wallets, the timeliness of the payments that we talked about, and how that can change consumer behavior. I think with every payment system or anything in globally, actually, we talk about, how do you change consumer behavior? So that's the wallet, the small payment information, or the small transactions. Those are going to lead to more change and faster change. So a simple example, again, being for how do I load money into my wallet that Elena mentioned. If I can make this very simple and consumer gets this first taste, and I went through this experience just some time back where I used to have a specific wallet. I could load money, of course, but it took upwards of 1 to 2 days. Sometimes it took 30 minutes, depending on what I use. Now, with the real-time payment nature, I just did a request for payment from myself, and within seconds, I had that money available in the wallet, and now I could start using it. That becomes behavior that you can then, once I get attached to it, that's what I'm going to use, and that will make me go away from the other old payment system types. And finally, I'll round it off by talking about how do you do the timeliness and the data piece of it together as we come to things such as request for payments. So think about issues with payment deficiencies, or people not paying their invoices or their bills. And now companies like your telecom providers, etc., can use these requests for payments to get the payments into the system. They would be willing to pay for it because now it becomes simpler rather than calling customers, telling them, hey, your bill is due, you're overdue. How do you make a payment? Oh, here, I've sent you a link on your phone. Or can you please go into your TD Bank bill payment system, pick me as the biller, and then make the payment? This is very simple. I've just sent you a request for payment. As long as you approve it from your bank, the payment is done, and bang, you met your deadline while I'm on the call. So those processes will become much more simplified. And again, there's huge business value to be untapped from the commercial side as well. So I'll pause there, and we can I see a lot of questions coming in, and we can start talking about those and get into one of those or more into detail.
Yep, thanks, Vipul. And you just triggered a comment I was going to make on a discussion that I was in on a use case in the US just last week, which was very interesting, having to do with the wallets. And it was an online gambling company, basically, where they had done studies that were fascinating to me. And I'm sure it all has to do with the psychology of gambling in general. But they found that when they were able to pay a gambler, a person gaming on their systems instantly, their winnings, that person actually turned around and gambled more and more and more. So there was something about being able to immediately see those funds and see the reward, I guess, for their efforts that then actually enticed them to spend more, to gamble more than if they had to wait for the winnings. And, they had done some very intensive studies. Obviously, that's their business, that had verified this. And so that was just fascinating to me. So they are very interested in using real-time payments to provide the winnings. It's kind of counterintuitive that you're giving them money, but by doing that, they've determined that the psychology is the person then turns around and spins it back almost immediately. So that was a very fascinating use of the wallet concept.
Laura, we've also seen that as well in the MLM world, because we had quite a few global clients that were involved in, multi-level marketing, and they get paid based on their sales. And so with real-time adoption of Rails, they were paying them out much sooner. And then that in turn increased the productivity and overall, exceeding of the sales target. So that same kind of immediate payment around the reward then, had those other benefits as well.
Yeah, so it's just a really interesting, some psychological benefits that the customers, that clients see in using this. Yeah. So let me move to a couple of the questions. The first one, Elena, was targeted more for the US and was asking, based on our experience in the US market, would you recommend a use case driven approach to launching an RTP system, or to a more broadly scoped and less constrained system?
Yeah, great question. The answer is yes. Just do it all. No, so it is a good question. I think you have to. What we've seen is you break it down in two components. So one is, we believe, and we think it's worked well, that the core infrastructure is generic. It accommodates as many use cases as you think about. That's why we use ISO 20 and 22, and we've learned from we definitely have learned from other countries on what to do, from format messaging to be as generic as possible, B2C, B2B, government, all of that. What then happens is you need to really spend a ton of energy on driving those use cases. And that's where when I was talking about a little bit about the flexibility of what you think you're going to do, you might need a pivot. You do focus, or we did, and I think it makes most sense, is you focus on a certain set of use cases to drive the volume. And then you grow into that, because everyone needs help in creating new things, right? So that's when you start with certain use cases, and depending on the success of movement of that, you pivot or you add according to that. And so we spent a lot of time working with partners and ecosystems to plant, you need to start getting seed volume, because kind of like the gambling example, Laura, I was thinking about, it's the same exact thing with financial institutions. If they work hard at joining the network, and they that day, usually, it's very common, regardless of the size, they get activity that same day. That sparks such a accomplishment within the organization that they said, okay, now I can enable this channel or do this send activity, and it sparks that next step. Whereas if it's not used, then it's okay, I got to do it later. So the use cases, the P2P use cases that we saw very early on, really help drive what you see on a statement, what the bank or financial institution could do, what the consumers now see when they start to transfer, wallet money, and they start to see that, so then they can then add onto it and be, continue to innovate on top of the network. So we now are continuing to innovate. We have token services that we're starting to look at and provide. We're adding more related to data aggregation and how do you simplify the data aggregation industry and the process in the United States. We're looking, kind of to Vipul's point, we're looking at document services on when you have this payload and you have documents and invoices and more data going through the network, do you store it so that you can keep that activity in a centralized location between the constituents? So those get overlaid a lot. But it's all on the premise that our core infrastructure was as generic as possible on day one. So hopefully that answers the question, Keith.
Okay. Next question had to do with commenting on interoperability between real-time payment systems, particularly cross-border. And that's a really interesting topic, a great question. It comes up quite often. I would comment that there was a press release not long ago where FIS actually has developed a product that's called RealNet, which is trying to solve exactly that nut. It was aimed primarily originally at merchants, but I think we're looking at expanding that to FIs who might not want to be in particular markets. But it is exactly that, intended to be, we will have arrangements to get into most of the many of the local instant payment schemes around the world and be able to transfer transactions from one to the other, handle the FX and all the other things that come along with it. The other interesting aspect of that is I'm also on a committee that BAFT, which is one of the funds transfer organizations that's actually global, has set up a subcommittee because there are concerns about the regulations being equitable for non-financial institutions such as FIS and financial institutions. And in the course of those discussions, a significant concern is whether or not various instant payment schemes, and it does vary by country, were ever envisioned to handle global payments. So in many cases, probably in most cases, the assumption was that the payments occurring on those schemes would originate and end in that country. And so there's a lot of discussion around, okay, if suddenly you have a player introducing global payments into that scheme, what are the implications for all the other banks on those schemes? Did they consider the sanctions scanning aspects that now suddenly come into play? Are the originators properly identified such that the banks receiving those funds can tell that they even originated overseas? So a lot of interesting aspects outside of the sheer mechanics of interoperability, but what are the implications of moving funds cross-border on that? And so I'll pause there and see if anyone else wants to comment on that topic.
I would make a couple of statements, I think, to build on what you've said, Laura. One of the things that I think is going to continue to emerge is we're going to see a lot of collaboration. And I think we're going to see more of this, almost like a payments as a service or software as a service, that really is going to help manage that interoperability. Because I think there's two pieces here. I think there's one, you've got some of the smaller financial services players that are going to need some assistance, even just to access the domestic rails. And I think that there's going to be some services around that. But then as the collaboration starts to happen, then that's where we'll see that interoperability nut get cracked, if you will. We're starting to see some moves already, even in India, right? UPI, they've really been seeking to collaborate with, a payments processor as well as FSS, and they're starting to try to figure out how do they take that and expand globally, and what are those key things like you've identified, Laura, especially around when funds are traveling and you've got to still have the right fraud and you've got to have the right scoring, and how do you manage through that? And so I think that, that's really become the focus as more and more rails have been implemented globally. I think that interoperability is the nut that needs to be cracked. And I think we will definitely start to see some more players and collaboration in this space.
Yeah, I mean, we see it today in region, like you mentioned India, but so in Asia and Southeast Asia, they have been exchanging between different real-time payment networks. And then also in Europe with P27, building a whole scheme around multiple country and jurisdictions. What I find interesting in those, and I think it speaks to that, is they have similar protocol, time zones, and AML rules and regulations. So those are the good pockets where it starts. And then as you start to go into diverse ecosystems, right, in us, say, going to Singapore, that effort, right, is always a bit harder. And it's funny, the conversations that we've been having, we work with different constituents to facilitate that. And, US and Canada certainly is one that we need to all solve here. At the scheme level or the network level, I think it's fundamental that it's built on day one, which is a good thing, ISO 20002, but now the overlay of the rules, the AML standards, I think will hopefully standardize as well. It's all part of the work to do.
Okay, let's move on to another question. And this one was, what are your thoughts on the cannibalization of e-transfer payment volume with the launch of RTR? So Vipul, maybe you could take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of it will occur, but I think I go back to the primary statement where people don't pick a payment type. It's like, I'm not excited when I pick e-transfer, and I'm not excited when I do a bill payment. What I want to do is I want to pay Michele for the lunch we had, or Elena for something else, or buy that home mortgage or something. So I think if we find the right value that satisfies those use cases, absolutely people will migrate towards that. And specifically coming back to e-transfer and RTR, I think a lot will depend on what the pricing is. Like how are banks and allowed to price it? How is Payments Canada going to look at it? Second thing is going to be, what is the value that you're providing, if at all we are able to price it, or if we charge for it, what is the value? Like one of the examples I took about payments collections, the collections use case. Like there are businesses who would be willing to make a payment for it because it's so important that it actually helps their balance sheet directly. So in those cases, yes, I mean, definitely instead of asking people to do e-transfers, they would say, no, do RTR. It comes in immediately. You're off the hook. Everything's settled. A consumer might be willing to make a payment, the last minute bill payment. I'm personally tired of getting a message saying, hey, make this bill payment, and 2 to 3 days later, it will be applied to your account. Like, come on, give me a date, give me a time. So if my credit card is due today, like I would love to just make that payment and say, yep, done, confirmation from both sides. But again, you have to ensure that both sides are ready. Like I could make the bill payment, TD Bank or other banks could enable that. But then let's say a telecom company, Rogers on the other side, needs to take that information, reconcile it, and apply it on the same time. And now I need to be ensured from both sides that it is complete. Otherwise, you're now leaving the consumer in the world where I'm calling up Roger saying, hey, TD man told me I made a payment. What do I do? And there you go. 60 days later, both companies are trying to figure out who made the payment at what time. So that's my long-winded way of saying that, yes, absolutely, there'll be cannibalization. I love cannibalization as long as it's for the right reasons and ultimately providing value not only to the consumer, but to the ecosystem, because that's what keeps us moving.
And I think the next question builds on this, which is, can RTR cause the debit card world to change significantly? Michele, maybe you want to comment on that? Or Vipul?
I really do, agree with Vipul's comments, right? And so I think, again, it's as he's clearly stated, it really goes back to the use case. And so, will we see, a difference in debit use in particular in Canada? I think, again, it goes back to there may be some cannibalization, but I don't think that's the key. I think the key is just really around the use cases and how we set that up and the value prop. And that also plays into all the things that Vipul mentioned as well, right? Around pricing in particular, right?
Yeah,
and then access too, right?
If I could add one other thing to this, like if you specifically take debit card, the one thing I guess I didn't emphasize on is the customer experience. What's the customer experience? So now everything that we are saying from, let's take Australia again, they had to do so much customer education to actually get them onto the real-time payment system. It was not only the banks putting the infrastructure. So you take debit and you have a specific use case where I'm going somewhere, I'm doing a tap, and immediately the payment is applied and I'm walking out. Now, if I make, as all the designs that I've seen so far, it's the QR codes or whether it's the request for payment, I take a QR code, scan it, and then the payments get made. I know the difference is maybe a fraction of a second or 1 second, but when I want that cup of coffee and I want to just walk out, it is going to make a difference. And I'm not going to wait, hey, great, I'm going to use that real-time payment system. I'm going to take the QR code and announce to the world that I use RTP over debit or credit for that matter. So it is.
Yeah, maybe I can. Oh, go ahead, Michele.
No, I was just going to say, even just the act of having to get out the phone and pull that up again. It's Canadians and their adoption and usage of debit in particular is, I think, a little different than other places globally. And so if we look at that, and exactly to your point, we're looking at how well the tap is used and accepted. I don't think that the experience of pulling out your phone and the QR code, I don't think that's going to have a major impact in that particular use case.
Yeah, no, I agree. And what we like the POS experience, I think is real-time payments are kind of all everywhere, I'll say, but it's that POS experience is a little different. And now buy now, pay later, it is really kind of the topic at hand, to maybe move some of the card activity, credit card, maybe more so than debit card. But then to me, behind the scenes is, okay, well, buy now, pay later. How are you planning for it later? Is that through your bank? Is that then through a real-time rail? And that's how you get it. So to me, the point of sale activity actually is interesting and evolving because you might not actually need to pay anything at the register at some point in time, right? So I find it interesting. The one other thing maybe I'll add, because we're talking about cannibalization a little bit, is because we get this question all the time, maybe not for debit card, but more so, ACH or wires, and is it cannibalizing there? What I remind people too is a lot of activity we see now is breaking up the payment itself into smaller chunks. So the payroll example, and the drivers are getting paid today for their activity today, not on Friday for 5 days worth of work. So the payment's smaller in that example versus one payment at the end of the day on Friday, or getting paid on a debit card, right, or a prepaid card. So the payments are getting smaller in a lot of cases, and I was equating it to how I buy on Amazon. I now no longer wait for 5 things in my cart. I'll buy one thing and then I'll buy another thing, and it might be $2 or $10 because of the way the experience is now, that I don't need to wait for that day because it's cheaper. it is very similar to a lot of the use cases we're seeing where things are breaking up. So another example is auto insurance, and we're ideating around, now that all our cars are in our garage, unfortunately, and we're not driving, why paying a monthly fee for your auto insurance where you could pay as you drive, and you pay that insurance as you go forward, or different things like that. So the cannibalization conversation assumes that we're economists and everything else remains constant, and we're just changing one thing, when really the payment system is evolving.
Yeah, and I think one of the other questions we've kind of touched on, which is exactly that. How do I have tap to use RTR? It's because that is such a popular, the tap is such a popular thing in Canada. And I would note that I also had a discussion yesterday, as a matter of fact, with a venture capital arm that we have at FIS that is looking at exactly that, a mobile app that they can put on to consumers. So they're looking at consumer to business payments, a mobile app they can put on the consumer that they could tap at the point of sale terminal, and it would execute it through a real-time rail rather than through ACH or debit card, etc. And one of their questions certainly was about the cannibalization of cards in general, because potentially credit cards, and what's the bank's reaction going to be to that. So that was another interesting topic that came up this week. So certainly I think we're going to see movement from one rail to another. And my comment to them was while yes, I think banks would be stressed to lose the interchange fees, the percentages they get off of cards, I think they would rather be involved in this than lose it and have nothing else to replace it. So there's going to be a lot of adjustment of, in my opinion, of moving with the market and making sure that you don't get cut out altogether because you're not supporting some of these newer rails. So I'll toss that out. I think we have just a couple of minutes left, and see if anybody else has any other closing thoughts.
I would just add to that, with everything that we have said, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? And I think that is what would answer whether you have tap on or RTR on tap. Because if both parties are getting paid, the payment is being made and you're out of there, the consumer doesn't care. But then on the merchant side, is it really where the merchant is getting the payment immediately? Is that a critical importance? And can you accomplish that, again, with a simple customer experience on both sides? I think if we solve that, that's where you can start thinking about like tap for RTR and others. You have to figure out what problem we are trying to solve.
We have one final question here, Elena, that might be addressed. You might be able to address, you might choose not to, which has to do with, can you comment on the fees and structure on any of the rails elsewhere?
Oh, sure. So purely from a network, right? The rail perspective, generally it's a transaction fee. So as transactions go through the network, there's no charge currently for non-monetary transactions. So it's only the credit transfer. That's pretty consistent, I think, in a lot of other jurisdictions. To focus mainly on a transaction fee, and then the way the banks, the financial institutions charge their customers, obviously is up to them, and we're not involved in that. What we generally say is, ACH is quarters of pennies or smaller amounts to that. RTP is a few pennies, and then wires is a few more pennies. That gives a bit of a gauge. I hope that helps.
So somewhere between the low value, the AFT in Canada, and the LVTS links pricing is where we would expect to see it based on what we've seen in other countries.
Yep.
All right. With that, I think that we are at time and we'll wrap up. So greatly appreciate all of the great questions. This is certainly an engaging topic, and one that is, extremely interesting as things develop around the world and will be developing in Canada over the next couple of years. So thanks everyone for your attention and participation, and your attention and participation to the conference as a whole. And hopefully next year we can all meet in person. So thanks guys, appreciate it.